A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Tuesday, we'll often check in with Greg Bondar, National Spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia, national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good morning, Neil. Delighted to be with you as usual.
Hey, Greg, let's start with talk about, the speculation that there is always in the lead up to federal elections. There have been some who've been saying, there could be even a federal election this year. And then there are all sorts of people crunching numbers and dates and such things and working out whether that's a possibility. But perhaps election 2025, the next federal election. What's your insight into what's coming?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Look, I do believe that Mr. Albanese is on a track for elections. In other words, he's put off his wedding, Neil. He said he's got too busy. He can't be worried about a wedding, and I think he's in election mode, Neil. So what that means for us is that we're going to have to consider, as Christians, how are we going to approach the elections coming before us. And I think there's a real benefit in having a look at what Scott Morrison's final speech to Parliament was back on the 27th of February.
Yeah, let's talk about what happens. You've got a Labor government, you've got the Conservatives, the Liberals, Nationals as the opposition. It's an interesting thing to reflect on ScoMo, the former leader, because he made some very impressive contributions on his final speech and around turning back to God. When you reflect on perhaps the conservative side of politics, and it might be another question to be asking about people of faith at the helm of the current opposition, but when you reflect back to calls from an opposition calling people back to God, how do you see things?
Yeah, no, look, it's very important that we try and identify with what Scott Morrison was saying. Now, I didn't agree with everything he did, but certainly as a Christian, he had my full support. Now, one of the things that Scott Morrison said on the 27th of February was that he wants everybody to reconnect with the Judeo-Christian values, which is really the foundation for democracy now. I think that's a really interesting call because as we go into an election in 2025, as Christians, we're going to have to take a biblical worldview. And Scott Morrison is telling us that, hey, let's get everybody back to God by looking at our Judeo-Christian foundation, because quite frankly, Neil, we're under threat from a drift to secularism.
This drift to secularism, and, there might be some who'll argue that Scott Morrison didn't fight back against that as strongly as he should have, but he has identified it, and he's identified this move away from Judeo-Christian values and basically calling the nation back to God. It's a pretty powerful comment coming from a former Prime Minister, and I don't know whether it got as much coverage as it should have, but certainly we covered on this program. But this drift of secularism and a call back to God, something that perhaps on all sides of politics, but especially those who might be acknowledging a conservatism in that, certainly be taking very seriously.
Yeah, I agree. Now, look, I've gone and analysed his full speech, and everyone can do that. They can just go to the parliamentary website and download the various speeches that politicians have done. But one of the things that I liked about the speech was that he actually quoted the Bible and declaring his faith in Jesus. Now, some say he should have done more of that while he was Prime Minister, but I can understand the difficulty that may have caused. The real issue, Neil, here is that, and one of the statements that Scott Morrison made was, which I totally like, and I'm going to tell you, I take my hat off to him, but what he said was, even if you don't believe in Christianity to be true, you should want it to be, because the foundations of Christianity are quite frankly what democracy is based on, what our morals are based on, our ethics, and I find it hard for anyone to argue against that.
He's left politics now. He is in a sort of consultant's role on some big things and concerning even the strategic and defence of our nation and things that are going on around the world. Let me ask you, one of the big things that was a concern was that when Scott Morrison led the charge for a religious freedom bill. It's just, anti-discrimination and all sorts of things get confusing in the way that we think about things, but he was trying to firm up religious freedom for churches, and there was a bit of horse trading going on, and some things didn't quite work, and the whole thing at the last minute was withdrawn and back to the drawing board. Let's get an insight here. Where are things up to in your mind around educational institutions and anti-discrimination? What is it that you understand about where the Albanese government might be at with that? Because they've had a promise to bring this sort of protection for the churches as well, but it hasn't got up yet.
Yeah. Now, you raise a really interesting point, because I can say, and it's not a secret, I was in Canberra about a week and a half ago, and I met with Senator Michaelia Cash, and we had a long chat about the Religious Educational Institutions and Anti-Discrimination Bill. Now, what Labor is proposing is totally unacceptable in my view. Neil, I'm going to tell it first on your radio program now, because I want you to, this is a scoop for you, Neil, that I can tell you now that the Religious Educational Institutions and Anti-Discrimination Bill will not go ahead in this term of Parliament. I don't care what anybody says. I think Albanese has played the card according to the electorate, that is the left-wing electorate. There will not be a bill in this term of Parliament, Neil, and I think he's going to use it as a trump for the next election. But, Neil, it's not going to go ahead. It can't go ahead because, quite frankly, he's blaming, you believe it or not, he's blaming the opposition for not coming back to him with a response to the bill. Well, hang on. No one's seen the bill, only a few people in the opposition. He won't release it. He's only given it to Michaelia Cash, but hasn't given it to all the backbenchers. So how can you respond to a bill that you haven't seen, Neil?
I imagine that when the draft was made available to some of the opposition, and I know you got a look at it, but you weren't able to copy it and take it away, I imagine that that was like a testing of the waters. What sort of reaction are we getting here? What sort of objections? What sort of amendments would be expected from the other side? And I imagine that there would have been too big a division, and they would have been thinking it's not worth picking a fight right now in the lead up to an election. How do you see things?
Yeah, totally correct, Neil. He doesn't want to fight. He didn't release the bill either to the mainstream Christian community or to the parliamentary backbenchers, which I think is unheard of when you're presenting a bill that you want to introduce. And quite frankly, he had an interview, a press conference in Perth on the 9th of August, where one of the journalists asked him some questions on the proposed religious discrimination bill. And his answer was, agreement hasn't been able to be reached because there's been no suggestion from the coalition of any amendments to the legislation. Well, hang on, Albo, you haven't released the legislation, and so how can we comment? And secondly, this is the real crux, Neil. He said, I don't intend to engage in a partisan debate when it comes to religious discrimination, and I think that is unfortunate. Neil, in other words, the bill's not going ahead. We've been duped again, and I think it's really bad. But having said that, Neil, let me just say to you that it may well be that the status quo is what we should have for the time being.
In the meantime, and we've had conversations on this program over the past week or two around issues to do with lawfare and Christian believers being dragged before some of these courts. There's a challenge there, isn't there? Because Christian ability to speak freely is not being protected. So somehow or other you want to someone to come up with, like a good formula that says this is how you can protect religious freedom. There's balancing of rights in all of that others are pushing for. But just take me into this here for a moment, because when we're talking about the way this affects people who are in the workplace, affects people who are on the front line, and Christian schools have been on the front line, it really is right back down into every family, isn't it? Because since all of these things began to develop since the marriage debate and since the redefinition of marriage, it affects every family. And I know you've been reflecting on just how close this gets to home, because even family weddings become an ethical minefield when you've got all sorts of things that you're endorsing. How do you see these sorts of things when it comes around weddings?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, one of the things I have to tell you is I've always been an advocate of a religious discrimination bill, because people like, you've heard in the news lately, Christians being taken to court to the human rights for over some paltry excuse. So look, I've always been an advocate. The problem we've got is, Neil, that if the bill goes ahead, then you can say goodbye to Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, which quite frankly would be disadvantaged the Christian schools. So that's a real issue. There's a bigger give and take. In terms of marriage, Neil, I have to tell you, it looks like I'm going to be invited to a same-sex marriage, and I'm still struggling. Should I attend as a Christian to a same-sex wedding invitation? And that's another issue for another day, Neil. But quite frankly, I think that since the same-sex marriage legislation has come in, our whole social fabric has changed, and people are expecting more and more takeaways in terms of watering down Christian beliefs and values and ethics and morals. And Neil, quite frankly, we're in a pretty much a no man's land at the moment, and I'm quite concerned about that.
Let's just stay with this on weddings for a moment, because when we pick up on this idea, and of course these days I can't pick up the statistics from memory, but lots more people get married outside of the church than ever before. In fact, people getting married in church, that sometimes is the point of contention. If there's a same-sex wedding that wants to happen in a church, sometimes there's all sorts of controversy there. But people, whether it's a same-sex wedding or not, getting married outside of the church, it's like leaving God out of the wedding. But weddings themselves are actually a pretty important, solemn occasion where vows are made before one another, and vows are made before God. And so when you're there at the wedding, you can be compromising your Christian values. How do you see things?
Yeah, quite frankly, Neil, you've hit the nail on the head, because marriage is designed by God. That's fact number one. Two, becoming a husband and wife entails a solemn covenant, and you've got biblical quotes right throughout the Bible. Matthew 1:18. 1 Corinthians 7:25, and so on. And three, marriage is intended by God to be both universal and sacred. Now, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, how can you support a same-sex marriage on those principles? So for me, I'm really struggling, because if I've been invited to a same-sex marriage, am I actually endorsing the event? Am I endorsing a publicly recognised covenant bond? What am I there? Am I sort of testifying to the legitimacy of the union? I'm really struggling with it, and I'd be love to hear from your viewers, your listeners eventually, what their thoughts are. But quite frankly, Neil, if I take a biblical approach, I'm going to find it hard to attend a same-sex marriage.
And the risk there, of course, is that, big bad uncle decides not to go to a family wedding, and it might even be your own child. How you actually make some sort of compromise there, that might be challenging. As I think, as you understand that when you're at a wedding, it's not the same as going to a birthday party. You can go to a birthday party and you can have a wonderful time and celebrate and dance and all sorts of things. But weddings are a little bit different, because weddings actually have a solemn vow before God and before one another. That's the challenge, isn't it? Because it's different to an ordinary celebration.
Oh, Absolutely, Neil. My wife keeps telling me, which I agreed with her to some extent, is love the sinner, hate the sin. The problem with that is still that if I attend a same-sex marriage wedding, am I actually supporting the legitimacy of that union? And that worries me because, I've got to, I'm here to please God, not man, Neil. And I think that's a real issue for all of us as Christians. Do I love them as a Christian? Absolutely. I don't love what they do. So what do I do? It's a real conflict for many Christians, mums and dads. And I know a lot of Christians, friends of mine, whose children are gay and they're in this situation. So what do we do? And I'm finding it difficult, Neil, to try and come up with a solution. But if I'm going to take a biblical worldview, then I will not be attending a same-sex marriage.
Just to throw you in the deep end here, Greg, that if you refused to go to the wedding ceremony, would you go to the reception? That's probably that might even be the compromise situation there.
That's not a bad alternative solution, Neil. Besides, if I go to the reception, I get a free feed and a drink, so that might well be well worthwhile going, Neil. But you're quite right. Again, let me say one thing to you, Neil, that people are watching us as Christians as to what we say and do in the public arena. And we've got to be very mindful of that. When people look at us, they're going to be pointing fingers and say, hey, Greg, did you go to that Mardi Gras? Did you go to that same-sex marriage? Did you go to that? And if the answer is yes, what do you say? 1 Peter 3:15, be prepared to give an answer. And I think we've got to make sure that we are prepared to give an answer. At the moment, Neil, I'm finding it difficult to attend same-sex marriage. That's not to say I don't love the people, but I find it difficult to attend.
Let's stay in the deep end for a moment here, Greg. You just take you into another prickly scenario, that if that's the way a Christian sees a same-sex wedding, what about when your brother has left his wife for another woman and now they've invited you to their wedding, and you might actually have concerns around the ethics of that and the issue of adultery by biblical definition. Do you use the same measure?
Now you've thrown me in the deep end, my friend. Again, I would have to question the legitimacy from a biblical perspective of that. You see, Neil, one of the things with the Bible, you can't make it say what you want it to. Either you're a Bible-believing Christian or you're not. Either you support Christianity's ethics and morals or you don't. So, Neil, you make a very good point, and I would be quite frankly challenged by that situation as well. Because, a biblical perspective means that you take a biblical worldview, and it won't be popular with everybody. It won't. But the point I want to make is that, and am I without sin? Absolutely not. But let me just say that challenged as a Christian means that we need to go back to the source, which is our biblical worldview in the Bible, and pray about it. And I'm sure that Jesus would have an answer. I certainly don't. But at this stage, Neil, I would be challenged by that scenario as well.
And I imagine, and I know you well enough to know that you're not talking about, having a heavy condemnation to people who may have done some of these things and supported weddings and family members and such things, but these sorts of things certainly worthy of talking about, and very few people will actually have the courage to talk about them and say, well, wait a minute, if you're really applying a biblical foundation, what did Jesus say? What would be a New Testament or Old Testament, a way of applying these godly ethics to current relationships? And I know that, without
Absolutely.
Condemnation, there's certainly worthy conversations around those things, and perhaps even talking about them way ahead of any sort of controversy that might unfold in your own family. Then at least you're not then coming and saying, this is something I'm going to compromise on. You've already got a foundation in place. But Greg, always appreciate your insights. National spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia. Also wears another hat, Every Home for Christ. And National Think Tank and Advocacy Group for Families, Liberty and Faith always appreciate talking about the politics and some of the ethics around some of these big issues here. Greg Bondar, let me point people to christianvoiceaustralia.blog. And I know you wouldn't even mind people connecting with you and taking things a little deeper around some of those ethical issues as well. christianvoiceaustralia.blog. Greg Bondar, thanks for joining us on 2020.
God bless you, Neil. Thank you very much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.